Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Labor Live at 12:05. My name is Alex Jorgensen, and I'm the Deputy Political Director here at the Alaska AFL-CIO. And we have an exciting program for you today, an exciting topic, an exciting guest. But before we get into that, we actually had some of the biggest labor union news in probably the last 60 years of organized labor here in Alaska. And that's that the staff at the University of Alaska system-wide, all 2,300 of them, have voted yes to organize their union. This is the biggest union election since well before I've been alive, and probably since the pipeline days. So we couldn't be more excited for our new brothers and sisters to join the movement, to join the labor movement, and finally get the representation at the university they deserve. But now to our topic. For the last couple of years, we've been talking a lot about education in Alaska. We've been having huge fights on increasing education funding as our schools have been really underfunded for a decade due to flat funding and not inflation proofing what we choose to spend on education. But sometimes there's also policy discussions that go along with that funding. And today we actually have an example where a group of people are trying to do both at the same time, which I think is always incredible. So we're talking, of course, about Senate Education Committee Bill 277, which is kind of an omnibus education bill that tackles a little bit of funding aspects and a few policy changes that some people have been fighting for a long time. So our guest, none other than the esteemed chair of the Senate Education Committee and Senator for District I, Löki Gale Tobin. Löki, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Alex, for having me.
It is great to have you on. Obviously, the Education Committee, as you know, has been busy these last couple of years. We were I don't want to say lucky because it wasn't luck. It was a lot of persistence from you and from other people in the legislature, that raised the base student allocation, which was so needed for our public schools. So it wasn't luck. It was determination and grit that got us there. But we got kind of that done. Obviously, I think we can all agree more needs to be done. But your committee has introduced a new bill, Senate Bill 277, that kind of has some policy and some funding aspects. So I'm wondering if you could kind of break down the core components of that bill for our audience at home.
Well, I'm very happy to. And I think the first piece I want to highlight is in 2024, we had a financial memo produced by our nonpartisan legislative finance division. And in it, we asked if we were to ensure that the purchasing power of the BSA was commensurate with the purchasing power of the BSA in fiscal year 2011, what would it take? What would be the amount we need to increase the base student allocation? And after some careful calculations and a lot of math that I personally do not understand, our ledge finance director produced a memo that indicated we needed to increase the base student allocation by $1,808. Well, as you know, we were able to secure a $700 increase, but that is woefully short of
Mhm.
the 1,808 that would have been needed to meet FY25 levels, let alone now we're in FY27.
Mhm.
And clearly, inflation has continued to outpace the increase in school funding. We also know that the way that the BSA is written into statute, it doesn't receive annual inflation adjustments like all
Right.
other departments in the state of Alaska. So we're continuing to try to increase school resources, but the appetite for just a straight BSA increase is not there with this
Mhm.
particular legislature. So we've been working to figure out what are some of the other common ground and collaborative space that we can work together in. So that's really the genesis or the intent of Senate Bill 277. As I've shared with many folks, if I had written it in a vacuum, it would probably be focused solely on pre-K and early interventions. That is a particular interest and passion of mine. However, I do take the responsibility of being the Senate committee chair very seriously, and I work with all of my members
Mhm.
to identify where we think we can find common ground and hopefully make significant improvements in our education system. The pieces of SB 277 that are less controversial uh, are the ones that are focused on increasing pupil transportation costs. We know that those are not commiserate with what the actual expenditures are across the districts. We think we're about 25% in lag, that there are just significant needs. We also have worked to identify some reading dollars that are really critical and important. The Alaska Reads Act just has not been adequately funded the entire
Mm.
time that it has been enacted across the state. And of course, there are some other smaller pieces in there from policies we've heard from stakeholders across the state. One is around regional resource centers needing to be able to hire retired teachers. And then, of course, looking at some of our other ways our schools within our school districts receive services. So our charter schools that rely on their districts to provide HR support and legal support and sometimes busing and other services, the administrative overhead has significantly increased. And so we allow for a provision that would increase the ability for indirect costs by the district to be recouped as they support our charter schools, as well as actually use the exact amount of administrative cost if 8% is too high.
Mhm.
So then we get to the controversial parts of SB 277, and that is
I love
really
controversy.
about
I
it's
love it.
been a bit of a controversy, and the part that I think is really important is we've heard from a lot of stakeholders who are just struggling to ensure that their kids have access. They want their kids to be able to play sports. They're interested in some distance learning or some correspondence programs because
Mm.
they're trying to learn a subject that's not offered in their local school district. They want a better and a more robust hybrid experience of education. And one that has been a struggle for our school districts is they're being asked to provide these extracurricular and after school activities while receiving no support from the state for those students. So we have kids who are in private school or perhaps in correspondence programs enrolled in a district outside of the community in which they reside, and they want to play on the basketball team, or they're interested
Right.
in attending after school programs, or potentially maybe taking one class in the school. But the district in which they live are receiving no resources to support that student. And right now, as many of our districts are faced with significant deficits, the Kenai is looking at closing all of their pools. And a majority of the students on their swim teams and their club teams are correspondent students who don't actually are not enrolled in their district.
Right.
Here in Anchorage, we've heard that they're looking at closing all middle school sports. And there are many kids who are in correspondence programs who are not enrolled in the Anchorage School District who participate in those programs. We were working to figure out what is a mechanism or a way that we can get some resources into the home district of the student while not eroding the support for the correspondence program. So we did that in kind of a four-step approach. The first is we increased funding for correspondence programs. So we added 10% additional resources to that correspondence program. We then recognized that the legislature should never get into the business of trying to micromanage relationships between districts. Many districts already have cooperative agreements. Anchorage and Matsu have one, as there are students who live in Matsu but attend in person classes in Anchorage, and they have
Mm.
a very strong, robust cooperative agreement. It's a great model. Districts should work with each other, and the legislature shouldn't get into the business of trying to determine what those contracts look like. So we then established in state law that the districts that have students who live in their district but are enrolled in a correspondence program out of district would need to create a cooperative agreement to ensure that the
Mm.
funds were there to support the student's learning experience. The third is one that we've heard from a few stakeholders is that if a student wants to switch programs, maybe they're interested in going back to in-person classes, or perhaps they're interested in enrolling a new correspondence program. Um, they they were having to pay back all of their materials. They were having to give back all of these resources that they have used their allotment to purchase. And in some ways, that was a huge financial burden and prohibited them from actually exercising choice. So we established in SB 277 a provision that said you get to keep all your materials and all of the curricula that you've purchased with your
Mm.
allotments. And then we looked at some ways to ensure that students continued to receive support from their district while not having to pay additional fees if they were enrolled in correspondence out of the program. There's been significant concern. I think there's been a lot of mis and disinformation about these provisions or what the intent was. And
Mm.
there's been a lot of fear that I think has been promulgated across the state. We have heard that loud and clearly. It was never our intent to erode an ability of a student to choose a program that best meets their education needs. We didn't want to harm any program. This is why we increased funding for correspondence, as we were also uh, ensuring that these cooperative agreements would allow for some additional resources to be shared with the home district that the student potentially was participating in additional programming in.
Mhm.
And we really wanted to figure out a solution that kind of met the needs of everybody. Uh, Obviously, we don't think that SB 277 is there yet. It's version A. And so we're going to continue to work on the legislation. We're going to continue to progress forward and figure out how we can continue to enact proven education reforms we know that are going to improve the student experience, while also getting some resources into our schools because they desperately need them.
And I think that is really the beauty of compromise. In my time growing up in this political world, I feel like I've come to the understanding that if everyone is not fully satisfied and fully happy, I feel like it means you're doing something right. Because, in this world of people want this and people want that, you do have to compromise. And I think there are a lot of great compromises in this bill that, I know correspondents and homeschool programs have been advocating for years that they should get the full ADM allotment of zero point 0.1 or 1 instead of zero point 0.9. So I think, there's definitely a lot of things in this bill that hopefully I think are after we can, air all the information out, can really bring people together because uh, we all know that our schools are struggling and we all want our kids to be successful. I mean, that's kind of like a universal belief that regardless of, what side you're on different issues, we all just want people to learn. We want them to be able to read and to be successful later in life. So that's really exciting that hopefully this bill is not quite maybe 100% there yet, but it's working the process of bringing people together to compromise and maybe we can get something passed.
Yeah, and I hope folks recognize and understand that these things don't happen in vacuums. I don't sit in a room by myself writing legislation or trying to come up with certain approaches to uh, education reforms without the input of the 59 other best friends that I get to work with in the legislature, as well as hearing from the broader public. And one of the things that has been very notable to me in this discussion, and as we've heard the public feedback on this legislation, is that people really do see the world from their particular lens, and they think this is a universal experience. And I just want to reinforce that I don't have a luxury of just hearing one lane or one perspective. My responsibility is to accept and appreciate the feedback from hundreds of thousands of Alaskans. We have over 130,000 kids in our public education system. 95% of all kids who are enrolled in K through 12 attend a public education option, whether that is correspondence or charter or optional or a neighborhood school. And they all have vastly different experiences, vastly different interactions with the system.
Mhm.
And while one thing might work really well for one person, it's not working well for another. And the hope and the dream is that divide the we don't divide the resources in a way that benefits one group over another, that it's really a fair and equal distribution, that everybody is getting the support they need and is also being held to the same accountability standards. And I think that is one that has become really notable as we continue these discussions, is the number of kids who are in brick and mortar schools, who take state assessments, who are working toward achieving particular education outcomes like graduation rates, and improvement on reading assessments or on state and national assessments, versus some of the kids who are in other types of programs that are still public education options, who have very low participation rates. And we don't actually know what is the education outcomes of that sub cohort of students. And that is concerning for lawmakers. We
Mhm.
are tasked with ensuring that our education system is high quality, and that means we need accountability measures to quantify whether students are exiting K through 12 prepared and ready to enter the labor force. And we don't know that for certain groups of students. And that is deeply concerning to me.
Right. No, absolutely. And you kind of alluded to that this bill is still kind of a work in progress. So, what are kind of the next steps or next evolutions that this bill is going to take, and how can people at home kind of get involved and share their input in the process?
Well, we will continue to have hearings. So I hope folks stay abreast of SB 277's progress by logging into akleg.gov and going to the committee tab. You can see the Senate Education Committee hearing schedule, and you'll be able to know which bills are being brought up in our public hearings each week. Additionally, there is a really cool little toggle at the very bottom of akleg.gov where it tells you that you can text a phone number, a bill number, and it will send you text updates about the bill's progress. So that's a great way to stay connected and involved with not much intrusion into your daily life. It's a text that you get once in a while. The last piece of it is that we're really trying to hear about this current moment that we're in and what are the immediate needs that need to be addressed. One that has really bubbled to the top has been the unintended consequences of some of the geopolitics happening outside of our control. And there is deep concern that some of our communities who barge in their heating fuel, who barge in their diesel, are going to get hit with a pretty hefty bill this year. One that they're not prepared or ready to absorb. And so we're looking to address that by potentially doing a one-time distribution of resources to districts for fuel costs, for energy costs. We think that that is going to be the most pressing need, and we don't want a district's heating needs to erode what they can do with their base student allocation, what they can do with their operating funds.
Right.
So we've been working on what might be an immediate short-term solution to currently things that we can't necessarily control, or things that we have no say in how they evolve. We also recognize that a big part of all of this is busing and transportation. With the increase in the price of gas, our school districts are having to absorb those increased costs into their current operations, and that means it erodes their ability to use operating funds to support students. So we're looking at trying to get some more money into our pupil transportation formula and help districts just get students to school, because we know if you're not in school, you have no opportunity to learn. And of course, my continued focus is on continuing to invest in the gains of the Alaska Reads Act. The numbers that just came out of our fall assessment are just so exemplary. I cannot pat our teachers on the back enough. They are doing incredible work to help our students who are struggling to learn to read build proficiency at grade level. And we continue to see those numbers improve. And we want to invest in that performance. We want to reward those teachers. So we're looking at putting additional funds into implementation of the Alaska Reads Act.
That all sounds fantastic. And you mentioned, increasing costs, and just circling back to what you said at the very beginning of the program for the folks at home that are doing the math on their own. You said that, if we wanted to, have a base student allocation that was commensurate with the purchasing power back in 2011 today, or I guess last year, we would have had to increase it by $1,800. We are still 12, $1,100 short. Yeah, there we go. I'm doing the math correctly. $1,100 short of that goal. So I know that the Alaska Labor Movement still supports increasing the base student allocation. Obviously, it's a tough time in Juneau to be asking for more money. Well, yeah. So, but I wanted to thank you so much for coming on the program, for doing everything that you do, fighting for the future success of our young kids in the state, and for fighting for working families every day in the legislature. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Alex.
Well, folks, that is it for today's episode of Labor Live at 12:05. But before we close, if you live in Anchorage, there is a very important election going on. Election day is next Tuesday, and your ballots have been mailed to your house. So if you have not voted yet, please do not put them in the postal system. Actually, take those your ballots to a secure drop box. That is probably the best way to guarantee that your vote will get counted on election day. So make sure you vote. Voting is important. And I wouldn't be from labor if I didn't say vote for candidates that are going to support Alaska's working families. So, folks, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.